Welcome to this YSL Excel VBA tutorial. In this part of our series on writing SQL for Excel files, we're going to look at how to deal with nulls in expressions. We'll start with a quick recap of how you test for nulls in the where clause of your query by writing some criteria, and then move on to look at how you can replace nulls in a column. We'll do that using a combination of the if function and the IsNull expression and the IsNull function. For the second half of the video, we're going to spend some time looking at how to prevent null results in calculations. And we'll do that for calculations involving numbers and involving text and involving dates. So let's get started. If you've been following previous parts of the series, you'll probably be fairly familiar with the basic setup by now, so you may prefer just to skip to the next chapter of the video. If you haven't seen previous parts of the series, here's a quick overview of how things work. We have a macro-enabled workbook which has a button which allows us to run a query, and when we do that it's going to extract some data from a separate Excel file called movies. This file contains a couple of separate worksheets, one containing films and another one containing actors. I'm going to keep this file open for the duration of the video, but you're welcome to close down the movies workbook and all of the code will still work. I've got both these files stored in the same folder, and I'll drop a link in the video description so that you can download these files and follow along and write the code yourself if you'd like to. Just to mention briefly that the code in the Nulls in Expressions workbook relies quite heavily on Microsoft ActiveX data objects, and that's not really the focus for this particular series of videos. We're concentrating on the SQL side of things. If you are interested in the ActiveX data object side, we do have a separate playlist which covers that, and I'd recommend starting with this video here, How Do I Get Data from a Closed Excel File Using VBA? Just to show you the basic code that I've already written in the Nulls in Expressions workbook, if I head into the Visual Basic Editor, clicking the Run Query button triggers this very basic subroutine, which basically just creates the SQL string which represents our query. That query then gets passed into a separate subroutine which deals with all the complicated stuff, such as establishing the connection to the movies workbook, generating a record set, and this is the point that our query gets used to set the record set source property. Then there's a bunch of code that deals with writing that information out into a new worksheet. So just to demonstrate that the code does in fact work, if I head up to the menu sheet in the Nulls in Expressions workbook and click the Run Query button, that's going to return a list of 3 columns from the film worksheet in the movies workbook. The reason I've picked both the budget and the box office columns is because each of these contains lots of missing values or nulls. Now we've already seen in a previous part of the series how you can test for the existence of nulls in a column by adding criteria to the where clause of a query. But I'd just like to start with a quick reminder of how that works, by selecting only those films which have no budget information. So to do that I can head back to the Visual Basic Editor, and in between the from and the order by clauses of my current select statement, I can insert a new line and begin with a double quote character and the word where. I then want to refer to the budget column, so I'm just going to copy and paste that from my select list, and then check if the value of that column is null. I'll type in a space before closing the double quotes, and then concatenating a continuation character. And then if I head back to my menu sheet in the Nulls and Expressions workbook and click the Run Query button, I'll find a list of only those films which have no budget. So it's a much shorter list than the one we saw last time, which included all 1200 films. This one only includes the 124 films which have no budget. If I wanted to reverse that, I could ask to show the films whose budget is not null. And it very much is as simple as heading back to the Visual Basic Editor and changing is null to say is not null instead. If I head back to my menu sheet in the Nulls in Expressions workbook, click the Run Query button, this time I'm seeing all the films which do have a budget value. At this point I'm just going to quickly tidy up by heading back to the menu sheet and then deleting all but the menu sheet. And then I'm going to head back to the Visual Basic Editor and I'm just going to remove that where clause. I'm happy that we've had a quick little reminder of how that works. If you're selecting columns which contain a mix of nulls and other actual values, you may think it looks a little messy to have those columns littered with these empty cells. And it can also affect selection techniques that we might subsequently apply to those columns later on. So for example, if I wanted to find the bottom of the title column, I could select cell A1 and use the end XL down technique to jump all the way down to the last populated cell in that column. If I try to do the same thing in the column which contains nulls, so if I go to column C, and I'll use the keyboard shortcut Control down arrow key, you'll see it jumps over the gaps to find the next populated cell. So it's always easier to use those sorts of selection techniques when the column is full of values. So for our first basic example of writing expressions to deal with nulls, we're going to replace nulls in the budget column with zeros, and then do the same thing in the box office column as well. Now, if you're familiar with doing this in other database applications, you might be familiar with the NZ or nulls to zeros function in Microsoft Access, or the IsNull and coalesce functions in Microsoft SQL Server. Sadly, those techniques don't work in the same way in the provider we're using to connect to an Excel workbook with ActiveX data objects. We have to use a slightly less sophisticated approach, which involves checking if the value of the budget column is null, then replace it with a 0. Otherwise, just display the value of the budget column. So we spent the last video in the series looking in quite a lot of detail at the if function, and we're going to use that technique in this query as well. So let's head back to the Visual Basic Editor, and then we can add a new column to our select list, which will begin with a double quote and a comma, and the if function, so that's IIf, and then open up some round brackets. I can then copy my budget column, f.budget, and then check if that is null. And I can do that in exactly the same way we wrote it in our where clause earlier on. I can then type in a comma, and if that condition is true, I can replace the null with a value of 0. Typing in another comma, if the budget is not null, so if the initial logical test returns false, then I simply want to display the value of the budget column. So I can say f.budget, close the round brackets, and then I can assign an alias to this column so that it doesn't have just a generic column name. So I'm going to say as budget, and then let's use the is null just to indicate the technique we've used to generate that column. I can then close the double quotes and concatenate a continuation character. And if I then head back to the menu sheet in the workbook, click the Run Query button, we'll see a column that contains where the budget has a null. The budget is null column contains 0, but where the budget value is actually populated, if I scroll down far enough, we'll find that we get the actual value of the budget field. Now let's do the same thing to replace the nulls in the box office column with zeros, but we'll use a slightly different technique to do this. Let's head back to the Visual Basic Editor, and then we'll add a new column in the same way as we did earlier, with a double quote character, a comma, and the if function, and open up some round brackets. This time, however, rather than writing the column name followed by the two separate words, is null, we're going to use the IsNull function. Slightly confusing that we have two slightly different ways to do the same thing with almost exactly the same text. The important thing here is that the IsNull function has no space in its name, so it's just IsNull, all one word. It's a function, so we need to open up some round brackets and then pass in the value of the field or the name of the field that we're testing for the existence of nulls within. The IsNull function in the provider we're using with ActiveX data objects is not the same as the IsNull function you may know from SQL Server. So here we have only a single parameter for the IsNull function, so we close the round brackets immediately, and then we can type in a comma and then place a 0 if that condition returns true. Otherwise, I want to replace the value of the box office column, so I'll say f.boxoffice. I can then close some round brackets for the if function and say as, and I'll go for box office, and I'll say IsNull as all one word. If I say it quickly enough, it probably sounds like a single word rather than two separate words. I can then close the double quotes and concatenate a continuation character. And then if I head back to my menu sheet and run that query again, we have a box office column which has zeros in place of nulls and the box office value where there is one to be displayed. Now there's no real difference between using the IsNull statement or the IsNull function. It's very much a case of personal preference. I think the important thing, as in any case when you have a choice of different techniques that achieve the same result, is to be consistent in the application of your choice. So I'm probably going to stick with the IsNull function for the rest of this video. For the next little example, I want to modify what we've done with our two budget and box office columns here. Initially, I've been quite careful to replace the nulls with a value of the same type for the values that we do find in the column. So I've used numbers to replace nulls in a column which contains numbers. Again, if you were in a different database application such as Microsoft SQL Server, it would be very important to make sure that you replace numbers or nulls in a numeric column with a numeric value. But with ActiveX data objects, we can be a little more relaxed about that. Perhaps it's a little misleading to display a 0 in this budget column. Did a film really cost £0 or dollars to make? And did it really make $0 at the box office? We could replace this with some more descriptive text instead. There is a possible danger of doing this, but let's have a quick look. If we head back to the Visual Basic Editor, rather than displaying the value 0, we can replace these by saying something like no value. So if we wanted it to be text, we just need to wrap that text up in some single quote characters. And I can do the same thing for my box office column as well. So having done that, if we head back to the menu sheet and we run that query again, you can see that instead of the zeros, we now have the phrase no value, but we do still have the numeric values when they are available. You can spot the potential problem with this, of course, in that the numbers that we do display have these little green triangle symbols, and you may already know what that means. If I select one of these cells at random and find a little warning symbol, it tells us that the number in this cell is formatted as text or preceded by an apostrophe. So that's just something to bear in mind if you are likely to use this column in subsequent calculations in Excel. Because you can't now guarantee what the data type of each individual cell or row will be, it may make it more difficult to add extra calculations later. But providing you're happy with that, then you can happily mix and match data types in your IsNull and IsNull expressions. For the next example, I'd like to look at what happens when a null gets involved in another calculation. So we're going to perform some very basic arithmetic. We're going to work out the profit for each film by subtracting the budget from the box office. So to do that, let's head back to the Visual Basic Editor, and I'm going to add a new column to my select list. So I'll add a new line here, open some double quotes, followed by a comma, and then I'm simply going to refer to the box office field first, and then subtract from that the value of the budget field. I will assign an alias. I'll say as profit, and then close the double quotes and concatenate a continuation character. Having done that, I'm going to go back to my menu sheet and I'm going to run that query, and we'll see that my profit column, for any field or any row I should say, where there's a combination of null in either budget or box office, the result of that calculation is also null. So that could be when both contain null, when only budget contains null, or when only box office contains null. Null propagation occurs when you involve a null in a calculation or an expression. The null effectively swallows up all of the other values in that expression and results in null at the end. And again, this looks a little messy in this column, so what we might prefer to do is replace those null calculation results with a 0 or some other value instead. So we can do that using the same sort of technique we've just used to check if the value of the column is null. Heading back to the Visual Basic Editor, you can pass entire expressions into the IsNull function, or check if the result of the entire expression is null using the IsNull statement. So I'm just going to use my IsNull function. That's the one I tend to use more often. So I'm going to copy the if and the IsNull function from the previous line and paste that in at the beginning. Box office minus budget, I can then close the round brackets. That's what I'm testing for the existence of null in. Assuming that is null, I want to produce the value 0 instead, followed by a comma, and if the result of that expression is not null, then I want to actually display the value of that expression. So I can copy and paste box office minus budget before closing those round brackets. Having done that, I can head back to my menu sheet and I can run that query again, And I'll see this time, wherever I had previously returned a null from that simple calculation, I now have a 0 instead. When both the budget and box office are available, I get the actual result of subtracting budget from box office. For the next set of examples, I'd like to change the table that we're selecting our data from the movies workbook. So rather than using the film table, we're going to move on to the actor table instead. So I want to change my query to select the actor's first name and family name to begin with. To do that, let's head back to the Visual Basic Editor. And I'm going to change, well, first of all, I'm going to take away my order by clause completely for the time being. And I'm going to change the from clause to say actor. And I'll give it a more sensible alias. I'll call it as A. And then I can take away a whole bunch of these columns, everything up to and including the first column, f.title, and replace that by saying a.firstname, and then concatenate that with a continuation character, and on the next line say a.familyname, and concatenate a continuation character there as well. And there's our basic query created. So I'm just going to head back to my menu sheet, and I'm going to delete everything but the menu sheet before running my query to return a list of first and family names for all the actors in that table. Now I'd like to add a calculated column which concatenates the value of the family name with a comma and a space, and then the value of the first name column. So to do that, let's head back to the Visual Basic Editor, and at the end of my select list, I can add a new column which starts with a.familyname, and then I can concatenate to the end of that, in some single quotes, a comma and a space, and then concatenate to the end of that the actor's first name. I can then assign an alias to that column, so I'll say as full name, and then close the double quotes and concatenate a continuation character. Having done that, if I head back to my menu sheet and run that query again, I get the family name concatenated with a comma and a space and the first name. Now everything here appears to have worked quite nicely, but we're going to change our query by adding an order by clause, and I'm going to order by ascending order of family name followed by ascending order of first name. So let's head back to the Visual Basic Editor, and at the end of the from clause we can concatenate an extra continuation character, and then we can say order by, and then I'm going to say a.familyname in ascending order, followed by a.firstname in ascending order as well. So a comma to separate those two. And then let's see what the result of that is. If we head back to our menu sheet and run that query again, we can see a minor problem with some of our actors, the pretentious people who've decided not to have a family name. So we've got Cher with a comma and a space in front of her name, and the same thing for each person who doesn't have a family name. Now again, if you're familiar with other dialects of SQL, this may come as a small surprise. If you were doing this same thing in Transact SQL, in Microsoft SQL Server for example, the null in the family name column would have resulted in a null in the full name column as well. But with the provider we're using here to connect to an Excel workbook using ActiveX data objects, the null in the string or the text column is effectively treated like an empty string. So we've concatenated an empty string with a comma and a space and then the first name value. I'd like to make sure that we don't get a comma and a space in front of people's names when they don't have a family name. So we can once again use that same technique using the if and IsNull functions to replace those values. So let's head back to the Visual Basic Editor, and then in front of the expression we've already written, we're going to say if, open some round brackets, is null, and open some more round brackets. I'm then going to take the value of the family name column, so I'm going to copy and paste that, and then close a set of round brackets, followed by a comma, and if that condition is true, if the actor has no family name, then their full name is comprised of simply their first name. So I'm going to return just the value of the first name column. I can then type in a comma, And assuming that they do have a family name, I want to concatenate that to the comma and the space and the first name. And then I can close the round brackets at the end of that expression to finish the if function. Head back to the menu sheet, run that query again, and things look a little neater and tidier this time. This example was relatively straightforward because we assumed that only the family name could be null and that there would always be a first name. But what if there was a combination of possibilities, as with the budget and box of is? Either both things could be null, only family name could be null, only first name could be null, or both things could be filled in. That makes things a little trickier, but we can still handle that sort of situation. But as we have multiple conditions to test for, it may make more sense to use the switch function rather than if. So I'm going to write a sequence of logical tests. I'm going to check if both the first name and family name is null. I'm going to place a value of no names entered in the full name column. Then if only the family name is null, then I want to display the value of the first name, so that's what we've got here already. If the first name is null, then display the value of the family name. And if both things are filled in, then concatenate everything together in the same way we have. Okay, so to make that work, we're going to head back to the Visual Basic Editor, and I'm going to change my if function into a switch function. So I'll say switch, open up some round brackets, and then to make my life an awful lot easier, to avoid having to scroll left and right with this enormously long line of code, I'm going to break this up into multiple different lines by closing the double quotes and concatenating a continuation character. So I'm going to leave my current expression as is. What I'd like to do is copy the IsNull a.family name and put that at the beginning. And then I also want to check and I'll paste that in again, a.first name is null. So that's my logical test. Family name and first name are both null. If that condition is true, I can type in a comma character and then in some single quotes say something like no names entered. Close the single quotes and then close the double quotes and then concatenate a continuation character. I've just realised that I've missed off the opening double quote character on the previous line, which I should have put in. There we go. And I'm going to add a quick space there as well, just to satisfy my need to have my queries laid out neatly. And at the beginning of the next line, open some double quotes and type in a comma character. So we've checked on the first line, if both family name and first name are null, then we get the phrase no names entered. On the next line, we're checking if the family name is null, then display the value of the first name. What I'm then going to do, after I've displayed the first name, is close the double quotes there and concatenate a new continuation character. Take this down to the next line and open up some double quotes. Then I want to check if the first name is null. So I'm going to copy and paste IsNull, a.first name, followed by a comma, and if that's true, I want to display the value of the family name. So I can copy and paste that. Close the double quotes, and we're nearly there. I'd concatenate another continuation character, and then at the beginning of the next line, open double quotes, followed by a comma. Now before I concatenate the family name to the first name with a comma in between, I need to check a condition. So I've checked if family name and first name are null, if only family name is null, if only first name is null. So at this point, really the only remaining possibility is that both things have been filled in. And I don't really need to test for that explicitly. I can write a shortcut by writing the value true, followed by a comma. If I tested that both first name and family name are not null, that would result in true anyway, so I can shortcut that to the value true. Okay, bit of a marathon example, that one, but if you follow the previous video on the if and switch functions, that should be no big deal to you. So we give this one a quick test. If we head back to the menu sheet and run that query, we'll find that we get basically the same end results. But at this point, you're welcome to head back to the actors sheet in the movies workbook and try replacing values, taking values away from first names and both first names and last names, and making sure that the same technique still works to handle all 4 possibilities. So we've tested for nulls in numeric columns and in text columns. For the final example, I want to check for nulls in a date column. So if we have a look back at the actor worksheet in the movies workbook, we've got a date of birth, or a DOB, and a date of death, or DOD column. Now, of course, not everyone has died yet, so we've got some blanks or nulls in the DOD column. I want to work out a very quick, rough and ready age in days for each actor. Now, for people who don't have a DOD, I want to calculate the age in days up to today's date. But for people who do have a DOD, I want to calculate their age in days up to the value of that date. So let's add in the basic calculation for the age in days up to today's date. If we head back to the Visual Basic Editor, I'm going to head just after my switch function. I'm going to add in a couple of extra columns first of all. So let's display the a.dob field. And then we can concatenate a continuation character and also include a.dod. If I could spell that correctly, we'll get there eventually. There we go. Now, one very easy way to calculate the difference between 2 dates in the particular provider we're using is using a function that you may well be familiar with from Excel VBA already, the dateDiff function. So if we add another column, I'm going to add a comma and say dateDiff, open some round brackets. The first thing I need to do is specify what unit of time I'm interested in, and we'll go into more detail on this in the video on calculations involving dates. For now, if I want the difference in days, I can just enter a single lowercase d as a string inside some single quotes. I can then type in a comma, and I can specify first of all the actor's DOB field, followed by a comma, and then I want to calculate today's date, so I can use a function called date. Again, just like the VBA function date. You must use open and close parentheses after the date function. It doesn't have any parameters, but to indicate that it's a function, it requires the open and close round brackets, I should say. I then need to close some round brackets for the end of the dateDiff function, and then I can assign an alias to that column. I'll say age today. I'm then going to close the double quotes and concatenate a continuation character, and then I'm just going to copy and paste that expression, in fact that entire line, and paste it in. And then rather than calculating the difference to today's date, I'm going to calculate the difference between the actor's date of birth and the actor's date of death, so a.dod. I'm then going to change the alias to say age DOD, and having done all that, I'm going to head back to the menu sheet, run that query again, and see what values we get for those 2 columns. So we don't have a very satisfactory answer here in either case. In the age today column, if an actor does have a DOD, we're reporting their age completely inaccurately. Even worse perhaps, in the age DOD column, if an actor doesn't have a DOD, we get this null propagation effect where the actors with a null in DOD have a null age as well. So we need to use a technique similar to the one we've used so far to check if the DOD value is null, then use today's date, otherwise use the DOD value. So we can do that back in the Visual Basic Editor. Let's copy and paste one of our 2 columns. Let's go for the last one that we added, the age DOD. So I'm going to copy and paste that entire line, and then rather than just saying a.dod here, we're going to insert an if function inside the dateDiff function. So I'll say if, open some round brackets, and then is null, and open some more round brackets. And I'm going to check if the a.dod field is null. I'm going to make use of that close round bracket symbol there, and after that I'm going to type in a comma, and if that condition is true, then I want to use today's date, so I can insert the date function with its open and closed round brackets. If that condition is not true, so if there is a DOD, then I want to use the DOD value. I can then close an extra set of round brackets for the if function and a final set of closed round brackets for the date diff function. And I'll just update the alias age DOD or today. So having done that, I can head back to the menu sheet and run the query again. And this time we should have for each individual person either their age as of today's date or their age at the point they stopped accumulating days. So there we go, there's a few different ways to handle nulls in your columns to make sure that the expressions you create produce a satisfactory answer. In the next video, we're going to investigate date expressions in a bit more detail, so I hope you're looking forward to that one. Thanks very much for watching this one as always. See you next time.